It's now time for questions to the Minister of Finance. And can I advise members that questions number 12 and 15 have been withdrawn? And I now call Justin McNulty.
Commissioner Hayne, question number 1.
A number of measures have already been introduced, including a £2 million emergency fuel payment scheme, a £55 million energy payment support scheme delivered by the Department of Communities, which is benefiting some 280,000 of the most vulnerable from the impact of fuel price increases. As a result of the absence of the Executive, my budget proposals to freeze rates for 3 years could not be agreed. Despite this, on the 2nd of March, I was able to announce a freeze in rates for the next 12 months. This is in addition to the extension of the Small Business Rate Relief Scheme, which currently supports almost 29,000 businesses' premises. In conjunction with other measures, including the freezing of housing executive rents, this provides further help for the rising costs being faced by families and businesses alike. An additional £300 million of funding has become available in 2022-23 since the draft budget was agreed for consultation. And while there is no mechanism to allocate this funding in the absence of an executive, I have asked ministerial colleagues to bring forward costed proposals on the supports which their departments can deliver. This will allow us to move quickly once an executive is restored. I will continue to press the British Government to take further measures, including acting on my request to waive VAT costs and excise duties for a period of time.
Call Justin McNulty for supplementary.
Thank the Minister for his answer thus far. Minister, you will be aware that the SDLP are working tirelessly to progress emergency legislation to access the £300 million that's been unused by the Executive. We want to allow for emergency financial support to be prioritised and given to people and hard-working families on the ground who need that money now. Minister, will you commit to supporting our efforts?
I would commit to supporting any and all efforts to ensure that we could see money that we have ready to support families is released, and I have no indication yet of the success of otherwise of that particular effort, but of course he will know that the clearest, most consistent way, the most obvious way to allow us to take decisions to spend money to support families is to reform the Executive and sit round the table and all get back to work and take those decisions, and that could be done in an instant. So while there may be other attempts and measures to try and see can we get around these things, and I have tried myself legally on a number of occasions, looked at possible solutions to them, the very obvious solution is the one that's staring us in the face, and that's to reform the Executive.
I call Gemma Dolan.
Minister, last week the Dublin Government cut petrol and diesel excise duties, and we've seen other countries around the world take the same action. By contrast, does the Minister agree with me that the British Government's response to this cost of living crisis is woefully inadequate?
Well, I had an engagement this morning with the Chief Secretary of the Treasury alongside the Scottish and Welsh Finance Ministers ahead of the announcement that the Treasury and the Chancellor of the Exchequer will be made on Wednesday. And I hope that it does begin to address some of the issues that we've been pressing them on consistently, like excise duties, like VAT on energy bills, like the rebate on red diesel, which is affecting rural families and farms and small contractors. And all of these issues, alongside the events in Ukraine, which are putting an even bigger squeeze on cost of living, are all creating a real sense of crisis out there. So there are steps immediately that the British Government could take, and I sincerely hope, as we press them again this morning, that we hear something substantial announced on Wednesday.
I call Mike Nesbitt.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. I thank the Minister for his answer. Would he support the call on the Chancellor to bring in an essential users rebate on fuel tax to mitigate the high costs which are impacting, for example, the haulage sector and indeed carers who clock up a lot of mileage?
Yeah, there's no doubt that the Chancellor and the Treasury have it within their gift to take measures in relation to this. And I think they need to look at where they're most needed. And I mean, the member has identified people who are essential users of fuel, and undoubtedly an increase in cost reduces the income to those households. In the case of carers, it's not a very substantial income in the first place. So any measure which can be taken, I would support, and we have been pressing them to look at any and all measures they can take between now and next Wednesday. And because we've been pressing for some time in relation to this, and the crisis has been deepening and deepening, and the implications of it for families and for individuals has been deepening, then I would hope that we do see something substantial, such as some of the measures that he has outlined, announced on Wednesday.
Call Andrew Muir.
Mr Deputy Speaker, households across Northern Ireland are facing real dire pressures as a result of the rising cost of living. Can I ask the Minister what efforts he's done in terms of engagement with Treasury to encourage them to abandon the increase in national insurance payments and also to uplift benefits in line with inflation as it currently stands?
Well, as I say, as of this morning, my latest engagement with them, I have been in touch with them on a number of occasions. This cost of living crisis has been gathering since the autumn. I don't believe the correct response in terms, although I very much welcome additional funding to our health system, I don't believe the correct response to that was to try and take it from national insurance contributions. And so we will continue to press them to take all and any measures that they can in the time ahead. I do believe they have some scope to take some measures. I do believe they have to recognise that this crisis is deepening by the day and the implications for people is becoming worse by the day, and therefore they have it within their power to do some very substantial initiatives in that regard, and I hope they take that approach.
Moving on, I call John Stewart.
Deputy Speaker, question number 2, please.
I have taken legal advice on this matter and I have written to ministers on an approach that would allow the Department of Health to utilise the additional funding related to the increase in national insurance contributions. It is important to say, however, this approach will not provide the same level of funding that the draft budget has set out for health or any other department, and it will not offer the certainty that would have been provided with a multi-year budget. In short, it is no substitution for an agreed budget.
I call John Stewart.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I welcome the Minister's effort on contingency planning, which I hope will allow key services to continue, as well as further spend on waiting list initiatives. But how in particular is the Minister taking into account the unforeseen funding pressures, which could be up to £50 million across the Trust as a result of increased energy costs?
Well, we have asked all of the departments as part of that to bring forward schemes which they might consider costed schemes, although we don't have the ability to allocate them, but I wanted to be in a position, should an executive be reformed, to move very quickly in relation to that, and I don't doubt there are energy cost issues across all of the departments. Of course, the priority, I think, has to be to try and help families that are under pressure in the time ahead. But nonetheless, the Department for Health have been engaging with our officials, and I'm sure they will be bringing forward some sense of where they see the pressures on the department in the time ahead.
I call Liz Kinnins.
Ask Concordia and thank the Minister for his answers. Minister, would you agree that the only way to guarantee that available funds get to our essential services, particularly our very much overstretched health service, is if the DUP end their electorally motivated boycott of the Executive? And isn't it long past time that the DUP put their selfish party political interest before the people?
Well, I mean, clearly the quickest way to deal with these issues, which everybody are feeling. Every single elected representative is in touch with the cost of living crisis in particular, and it's undoubtedly something that's not just begun to be felt, it's increasing on a daily basis, the actual pressures that is bringing around. And you know, when we're into a new financial year and some bills start to come falling onto the doormat, then I think people will really feel a very acute sense of pressure. And of course, we don't have all the funds that we would want to do to deal with all of the issues that we want to deal with, but we do have funding available to us, and there is an opportunity to try and provide some support to families in the time ahead. The quickest way that can be done, I've heard various intricate solutions to all of that, none of which have borne any fruit to date. The quickest way that we can do that is actually get back to work with each other, sit around the table, prioritise the issues as we have done in the past that need to be addressed, and allocate the funding to try and provide some level of support.
I call Matthew O'Toole.
Deputy Speaker, while I agree that collapsing the executive is utterly wrong, it was as wrong now as it was in 2017 whenever the Minister's party did it, I do hope that he's able to support the SDLP proposal should we be able to get it onto the floor of the Assembly to unlock that money and spend it on cost of living. But can I ask, Minister, have you had any conversations about, should there be further Barnett consequentials at the spring statement on Wednesday, will your department be able to spend them?
Well, I'm tempted to remind him again of his encouragement of us to bring down the Executive in 2017. I know he wasn't here personally, but he can check back on Hansard of that time to see what his party's position was in relation to that. I did actually raise this issue this morning in my discussion with the Chief Secretary of the Treasury. He was fully aware that the absence of an Executive is impeding our ability to actually respond to the crisis in front of us. And I did say to him that he needs to take that into account if there is the potential of some Barnett consequences coming as a consequence of the spring statement, that we would need to try and receive it in a way in which there was some possibility of us being able to spend it. So the officials undertook to go off and examine that, and my own officials will be in touch with him in the time ahead, because as he will know, if it comes across simply as an unhypothecated Barnett, then it requires an executive approval to make sure that it's spent.
I call Paula Bradshaw.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Thank you, Minister, for your answer so far. Minister, you'll be aware that hopefully this week the new cancer strategy will be published. In your response to Mr Stewart, you talked about the departments coming forward and presenting their pressures. Obviously, there'll be new costs within this new cancer strategy, and obviously very timely that we get these implemented. What is the prospect of funding forthcoming for the new cancer strategy without an executive? Thank you.
Well, as the member will be aware, in the proposed draft budget, I had proposed to fund the cancer strategy in full, and that's not possible when we haven't got an executive to agree budget going forward. So what we have been able to do is through the vote on account is to allow the department to go forward on an assumption of spending of about 45% at its baseline. That doesn't provide any additional money for things like cancer strategy, mental health strategy, elective care strategy, all of those additional things that were costed in the draft budget and provided for. So I'm afraid it doesn't allow us to do those issues. We'll continue to engage with health to see what support we can get them, how we can get them support, because it's crucial that it is provided in the time ahead. But I have to say that from my perspective and from the legal advice I've received, our hands are firmly tied by the fact that we haven't the ability to sit around the table as executive ministers with each other, plan and agree these matters and allocate the funding accordingly.
Jonathan Buckley is not in his place. I call Cara Hunter.
Minister.
The draft budget allocated over £300 million for green growth. While this funding was not ring-fenced within the departmental budgets, departments were encouraged to provide details of the green growth projects that are taken forward as part of the budget consultation. In the absence of an executive, it will not be possible to agree a multi-year budget, and therefore any plans to finance net zero targets will have to wait until an executive is established.
I call Cara Hunter for something.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I'd like to thank the Minister for his answers so far, and I, like many across this House, was very pleased to vote in favour of the Climate Change Bill a few weeks ago. Does the Minister agree with me, though, that without the long-term funding in place to support us to reach our goals, the new Act could potentially be doomed to fail? Thank you.
Well, I sincerely hope it doesn't, and I mean the intent has to be to get the executive back in place as quickly as possible. It's one of a range of hugely important areas that we face as a society. We have an ability here to take decisions, and even within the limited funding that we have, to try and allocate funding to things which are priorities for us in this part of the world, and that's the essential purposes of us being here, to take those types of decisions. So putting an executive back in place as quickly as possible is the way to do that, is the way to make sure that we finally, having got a 3-year budget, we are able to take advantage of that in terms of planning and setting targets for ourselves in the time ahead, and so the sooner an executive is put back in place to take those decisions, then the better for everyone here.
I call Philip McGuigan.
Very good. And the Minister, you in your answer, you mentioned green growth. Can I maybe just ask you to detail a bit more in terms of what provision and strategy was in the multi-year budget for green growth?
Well, we had, as I say, proposed the £300 million for green growth. We had also considered ring-fencing that, but on the advice of the Department for Agriculture and Environment, it wasn't ring-fenced, or the proposition wasn't put forward, but it was available to be bid for, and of course then that would have formed discussions as part of the budget consultation. My own department releases a high-level documentation, then each department would release some specific proposals in relation to that. So we didn't get to that position because the executive went down, unfortunately. So the sooner we can get back to that, we can actually see what green growth strategies are being brought forward by departments to match the funding that was proposed for it, then the better.
I call Rosemary Barton.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Thank you for your answer so far, Minister. Minister, yeah, so are you confirming that that you have not been asked to scope out likely resource for capital DEL or DERA requirements in relation to zero target by 2050?
Well, as I say, there was a sum of funding set aside, proposed to be set aside for that, and departments then in their own budget planning would have brought forward some propositions as to how they would have spent that. And we didn't get to the stage where that could be done in the detail that we wanted it to be done. So I would assume that if an executive can be put in place quickly, then we get back to that exercise and we see what departments we're going to bid for, and then we see how that matches the targets. But that's a collective decision. This isn't any single department's responsibility. We all have responsibility in relation to net zero, and the executive has set the targets, and then we have responsibility to see what particular projects would lead us most quickly to that area. And so that it clearly is a collective decision, and we haven't been able to get there. And that's very unfortunate, because I mean the impacts of climate change don't wait until an executive is back in place here. It carries on, damaging the planet as we speak, and so we really need to quickly get back to those decisions.
I call John Blair.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Deputy Speaker, following passage of the Climate Change No. 2 Bill, will the Minister seek to ensure that all future financial decisions are climate change proofed, to ensure we play our part in averting climate catastrophe and also to meet the targets set in that legislation?
Well, I think when the executive has agreed and the bills confirm the agreement of what targets that we're facing, then we have to ensure that all executive decisions meet that, and they play their part in meeting that direction of travel. And so, while I wouldn't have the power to go down into each department and specify how the spend, our devolution arrangements allow a significant degree of autonomy within each department, and that's part of the power sharing framework that we have. But nonetheless, then each department is subject to the legislation, and the legislation has targets in place. Then spending decisions should reflect the desire to meet those targets.
Jerry Carl is not in his place. I call Jim Allister.
The department has arrangements in place in relating to the use of official vehicles. And this in regard to journey costs. This is in regard to journey costs, road and weather conditions, speed limits, parking, passengers, use of mobile phones, smoking, and adhering to the provisions of the Road Traffic Order 1995, which concerns the consumption of alcohol or the use of drugs.
I call Jim Allister for supplement.
Does the Minister accept that the ministerial car is a departmental asset? So what would give him the right to use it for private business, such as he has done? And does he apologise for such use, given he heads the department that has oversights for how civil servants conduct themselves in regard to the rules?
Well, as I said in my many answers to the member, I have reimbursed the department in relation to the cost incurred, which was £4.36. And given that he has not only encouraged but provided public support for his friends in the DUP to shut down the executive, and by doing so deny us the right to set a multi-year budget, deny us the right to allocate over £300 million to families who are struggling at this time. I think he's a very strange sense of priorities when he's starting to obsess over £4.36.
Moving on, I call Padraig Delargy.
Question 7.
I've been raising this matter with the British Government ministers for 2 years now. The continued lack of detail on shared prosperity funding is concerning. The British Government's engagement to date on EU structural fund replacements has been wholly inadequate, with a failure to recognise the impact of the loss of approximately £80 million per annum to spending power here. Following the receipt of legal advice, I have written to ministers seeking approval to share their high-level department priority investment options with the Department for Levelling Up and Housing and Communities. I would like to thank ministers for their responses and confirm that their departmental information has now been shared. This will enable the department in London to draft locally specific options to be included on the upcoming Shared Prosperity Fund prospectus and investment framework. I recognise that a lack of detail in the Shared Prosperity Fund is causing significant anxiety for groups, particularly those within the voluntary community sector, and I and my department will continue to engage with Whitehall on this fund.
I call Padraig Delargy for supplementary.
I thank the Minister for his answer, and a greater role for the Executive and the Shared Prosperity Fund is welcome. But would the Minister agree with me that this still falls woefully short of the British Government's commitment to fully replace the EU funding that we've lost as a result of Brexit?
Yes, I do, and I raised this very point this morning again in the meeting that we had with the Chief Secretary of the Treasury. The fact that the £80 million, which we traditionally use through the Department of Economy and also the Department of Communities to target skills and assisting people into employment has not been replaced at all, and the groups that provided that sort of service for us now face the prospect of trying to secure the money from the department's own budgets, impacting on other services that it provide, or taking a potluck chance in relation to the Shared Prosperity Fund, which they might be successful or might not, and that's no way for those groups to continue to provide the services that they've been providing over many, many years to such great effect. Also, in terms of the tailing off the netting of the budgets, particularly in relation to farm funding, that will leave us significantly short over the number of years that the previously EU funding would have provided. So clearly, replacement of EU funding may have been written up on the side of a bus, but it hasn't materialised in forms of our own Brexit experience.
I call Matthew O'Toole.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Minister, this is nothing short of a scandal, what's happened with replacement EU funding. Despite the Economy Minister's desire to sweep this under the carpet and pretend like his department doesn't face a huge funding black hole, and community and voluntary organisations don't face a huge funding black hole, this exists. Excuse me. We are weeks away from the end of the financial year. In fact, we're days away from the end of the financial year. What representations has he and his department had from the Economy Minister? Because there are literally community and voluntary organisations out there now who will not be able to make financial plans for next week because they haven't had clarity from that department. What has he heard from the Economy Minister?
Well, the member will be aware that we raised this. This is an ongoing discussion, a topic of discussion for some time, and I had many meetings with people in that sector, and I was very much aware of the cliff edge that they're facing, and also the services that they provide to us at a time when there are job opportunities, where our economically inactive numbers have grown, but there are job opportunities out there for people. That this is precisely the type of service that we need to be focusing on at this time. I did offer up, I recognise that the gap that was there. I also recognise that there is a hole in the Department of Economy's budget in relation to previous funding that it relied on to meet these issues. I did offer up a solution to both the Department of Communities and the Department of Economy in relation to putting up funding or giving certainties in advance to the groups that were involved. The Department of Communities took up that option. The Department of Economy wrote to me and said they weren't taking up that, but they would provide the certainty that would be required. So I hope that they are engaging with those groups. I hope that they are getting some level of certainty. I have to say I haven't heard that, but I recognise, as he does, that we're very fast approaching that cliff edge, and that they need some clear sense of how they'll be funded in the next year in order to retain the staff that they currently have and make sure that they're there to provide those services.
Moving on, I call Patsy McGlone.
Ceist Ever Hocht. Question number 8, Mr Deputy Speaker, please.
Last Concordia, with your permission, I'll answer questions 8 and 9 together. The hubs in Ballykelly, Downpatrick, Ballymena and Craigavon are complete and will become operational when appropriate. Progress is advancing well at the Connect 2 hub in Bangor and Omagh, and planning has started for additional hubs in the Antrim Newton Abbey area, Derry, Mid-Ulster, Enniskillen and Newry, all of which are planned to be delivered over the next 2 years.
Call Patsy McGlone for supplement.
Thanks very much. Minister, could you give me some details, because up until now Mid-Ulster, which is one of the, as you will know, one of the fastest growing economic areas that there is in the north, could you give us any advice as to when this scheme might take place or start in Mid-Ulster?
Well, I think there was a recognition when we looked at the council areas that had been provided in the first run of this, that Mid-Ulster was a notable gap. And of course, we do want to ensure that there is that ability across all of the council areas. The initial programme for this was mapped on data as to where people were travelling in to Belfast from, to make sure that the areas that had the highest levels, highest numbers of people who were travelling in were dealt with. And we have worked our way through this. We have a very good working relationship with local government, and I'm sure we are engaging with Mid-Ulster Council to identify a suitable location, to work in partnership with the Council to make sure that it fits into their economic development strategies as well. So the purpose of these was to put them town centre, to make sure that they had an added benefit. It wasn't sitting somewhere out in an industrial estate, but they brought people into the town centre. They coincided with Council's own development plans, so they harmonised with that. And so we will continue to engage. Now, the time frame for that I'm not certain, but the sooner we get that level of engagement, identify a site. But we have been pressing ahead with these. There are a number ready to open once we get the back to work announcement from the task force and the Department for Health. And I think they will be a success, and there is a significant level of interest in them. And I think they will actually generate additional interest from people in those areas and create more opportunities in the longer term for people to apply for civil service jobs when 5 days a week travelling in and out of Belfast is not part of that job.
I call Andrew Muir.
Very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. One of the main civil service accommodation areas is in Bangor at Rathgale House. Can I ask the Minister whether consideration is being given to relocating within Bangor Town Centre to aid the regeneration of Bangor Town Centre?
Politics is all becoming very local now this week for some reason. I'm not sure why Rathgale House was chosen, or if there was another option available in Bangor. I'm very happy to go back and check on that. As I say, the broad template is to look for available property, to discuss with the local government to make sure it fits in, to be as town centre as possible. Rathgale House is slightly out of town centre, but to be as town centre as possible, and to ensure that we allow people to have that flexibility to work a number of days a week from their own area, and also provide a space perhaps for local government officials to meet with central government officials, so we can have that kind of break down some of those barriers that there are between the various strands of administration here. So I am happy to check to see was there another property available in Bangor Town Centre, but availability of government-owned property is one of the key criteria as well, and that possibly was why Rathgale House was chosen.
I call Nicola Brogan.
Glasgow Corla. I'm going to continue the local politics trend and ask you for an update on the civil service hub in Omagh, please.
Yes, I said in my original answer that Omagh is one that is very much that they're advancing well in the Connect 2 hub in Bangor and in Omagh. So yes, it's been advanced. It's not up maybe at the same level as the first few that we have done, but it is moving with some degree of progress. And it has been a very useful engagement with Fermanagh and Omagh Council to make sure that we get the right place. I know there's a lot of property in Omagh that's actually government owned, and quite a lot of it is surplus to requirements now, so we want to get the place that was the right fit to make sure it coincides with the development plans for Omagh Town Centre, and that it makes a contribution to all of that. So I've been informed that progress is going well there, and I would hope to see some more movement on that in the near future.
I call Mervyn Story.
Mr Deputy Speaker, and thank the Minister for his answer so far. He does, in his original answer, talk about when appropriate. Could he elaborate as to what that means, and does it mean when we have in place a proper return to work policy so that spaces that have been identified are no longer continually being vacant?
I think the member is correct. What we're waiting on is the advice. At the moment, the official advice is that people should work from home if possible. And so we as a government department, we can't counteract or countermand that advice. And so I have asked the task force if they're looking at this issue, and they'll obviously discuss with the Department of Health what the latest advice might be. And we're still in. The pandemic is not gone. There's still a lot of people who are contracting COVID-19, and there are still people dying, unfortunately, from COVID-19. So we have to have a cautious approach in terms of emerging from this, although there is a great sense that we are at last seeing a lot of light at the end of the tunnel. And so we're waiting on that advice and making sure that we adhere to that. We have been developing policies in terms of what return to work looks like. Because it undoubtedly will have changed. There is much more opportunity for people to have a flexible approach to work in the time ahead, and we need to recognise and accommodate that. And IT solutions have advanced very rapidly over the pandemic, which allows us to do that. And I think that's good for the civil service generally, because I think that does make the option of working in the civil service more open to more people from more rural areas, peripheral areas, but also to more women. As well, to make sure that our civil service is more reflective of society it serves. So yes, we are waiting on that advice, and as soon as we get that, we will press ahead as quickly as we can.
I call Rachel Woods.
Question number 10.
With your permission, Glasgow Corla, I'll answer questions 10 and 14 together. In the absence of an executive, it will not be possible to agree a final budget for 22-25. However, there are mechanisms in place which will allow departments to continue spending to maintain public services. The vote on account, which is included in the budget bill, which has just concluded its passage through the Assembly and is awaiting on royal assent, will allow departments to continue spending until the summer. This on its own may provide time for returning executive to agree a budget and a budget number 2 bill to be passed. However, if that is not the case, then from the 31st of July, the Department of Finance Permanent Secretary may approve the issue of cash and use of resources under Section 59 of the Northern Ireland Act 1998 and Section 7 of the Government Resources and Accounts Act 2001. Of course, neither of these allow departments to plan effectively, nor do they provide the additional resources included in the draft budget. I am considering measures that may allow the Department of Health to plan on the basis that its budget will increase by the £400 million generated by the National Insurance increases. However, even if that is possible, the lack of an executive will still mean there is a significant funding which cannot yet be allocated in 2022-23, and this includes some £300 million that has become available since the draft budget was announced.
And that is the end of our period of time for listed questions, and we now move on to topical questions. And can I advise members that questions number 1 and question number 5 have been withdrawn? And I now call Deborah Erskine.
Thank you. The Minister will know access to banking services is very important in rural areas, and a number of banks have closed over the last few years in towns and villages. Can the Minister detail what support his department is giving, which provide people with access to cash in those rural areas?
Well, we have had a number of engagements with the banks, and I recently hosted a banking forum about a month ago, in which we brought together the financial institutions, we brought together the credit unions, we brought together the unions and some of the business organisations, because there is a recognition that a lot of branches have been closing, particularly in small towns, and I know there have been 2 in my own constituency, in Crosswood Lane and Katy, and that has a very significant detrimental impact on the town centre. Unfortunately, at a time when Bank of Ireland in particular was closed nose, it's just announced a massive profit for this year. So undoubtedly communities that feel left behind as a consequence of that will reflect ruefully on the money that's been made by the Bank of Ireland in particular, and it's not unique to the Bank of Ireland that are closing premises across the north. And I understand there is more digital banking now involved and people are less using branches, but you, as I represent a rural community, and these services are essential. So we have been impressing on banks the need to keep supporting particularly rural and peripheral communities. We've also, later this afternoon, will bring forward the rates order in relation to rural ATMs, so we're incentivising people to keep rural ATMs, because that now becomes one of the only mechanisms for access to cash in rural communities, and so that's very important. So in that regard, we're doing what we can to continue to support the access to cash, but we need to continue to press collectively. We don't have responsibility over banks, that lies in London, but we need to press them to continue to support communities, and particularly rural communities.
And I call Deborah Erskine for supplementary.
Thank the Minister for his answer. Just in relation to the rates relief, I know that a number of buildings will be included in that, which is good. I know that that may be a small number of buildings which may not actually be representative of ATMs across Northern Ireland. Can you detail maybe why that is the case in terms of those numbers of buildings, and is there anything further that can be done in relation to those ATMs in rural constituencies?
Well, it is a rural ATM support, and it recognises specifically the problems with access to cash in rural areas. It tends to be that urban centres are well enough served by ATM provision. So in order to, a number of rural ATMs have closed, so in order to try and incentivise them, we have given rates relief on rural ATMs, and that is measured by the indexes which say what is a rural ward or what isn't a rural ward. That's what dictates if the location was in what is considered to be a rural ward, then they're eligible for that support. So if more ATMs may open up, and I know even in a situation where banks have been closing them, other companies have been coming in and providing them, then they may well be eligible for the rates relief for rural ATMs. So it isn't a fixed thing. It is based on the meeting the criteria of being in a rural ward and providing that service, but it is specific to rural in recognising that they have particular problems in accessing cash.
I call Pat Sheehan.
Young Corla. Ordinary families and workers are facing mounting, if not intolerable, pressure as the cost of fuel and everyday necessities spiral. And some ministers, like Deirdre Hargey, have shown leadership and compassion by introducing support such as the £200 fuel payment, welfare extensions and rent freezes. Can the Minister outline what additional financial support would have been available if the DUP had not walked out of the executive in an attempt to shore up their own electoral fortunes?
Well, undoubtedly those schemes are very welcome, and but we also recognise that they're not enough, and that this crisis has been deepening almost on a daily basis, and the events in Ukraine have only just added to that sense of crisis as well. And so there's clearly a need for more action, and some of that is within the responsibility of the British Government, and that's why I've been pressing them again this morning in relation to taking action. We hope to see some announcements on Wednesday which will have a significant impact on how people are meeting challenges in the time ahead, but we have no indication of whether they will take up that opportunity or not. In relation to further schemes, of course, as I've said many times, we have £300 million which came after the draft budget was announced that we were able to carry over, and I have asked some departments to bring forward propositions to how they might spend that, even though we haven't got the ability to allocate it. But I want to be in a position, if an executive comes back into place, and I sincerely hope that it does in the very near future, then we are already ready to hit the ground running in terms of providing that very necessary support to families and to workers.
Call Pat Sheehan for supplementary.
Would the Minister agree that many of the causes of the cost of living crisis are firmly rooted in disastrous British government policies such as Brexit and austerity?
Order, members. This is question time. Ready to continue.
And that Boris Johnson's government therefore has a responsibility to take action on issues like reducing excise on fuel and home heating oil, abandoning the planned hike on national insurance contributions, and introducing a windfall tax on profiteering energy companies, so that this money can be
we have a question, please?
So that this money can be redirected to those who need it most.
I have raised some of those issues this morning. I've raised them over a number of months now in relation to that. Undoubtedly, we are finding ourselves in an ever-increasing crisis as a consequence of a series of political decisions, and Brexit has been detrimental to all of our economic issues here. The protocol is trying to mitigate against that and undoubtedly needs work done to it, but it is in fact a mitigation measure. And so, yes, there are opportunities. The British Government do have responsibility in relation to excise duties and VAT on energy bills, and also in terms of the energy companies who've been obviously doing quite well out of arrangements over the last number of years and making significant profits. There is an opportunity to look at what their contribution can be. These are all matters only the British Government itself can address, and that's why we have been pressing them for a number of months now in relation to this, because this crisis has been building since the autumn and worsening as time has gone on. And I hope they take the opportunity on Wednesday to announce some significant interventions in that regard.
I call Padraig Delargy.
And I thank the Minister for his answers so far. Minister, when I worked as a primary school teacher, I saw firsthand the need for free school meals for vulnerable children to be supported. And one of the schemes which had been brought forward was a holiday hunger scheme, which would support children during periods of school leave until 2025. This now can't be guaranteed because...
Can we have a question, please?
This cannot now be guaranteed until 2025 because of the DUP collapse in the executive. Would the Minister agree with me that this is an absolutely disgraceful policy and that it needs to be addressed by the DUP urgently?
Well, I mean, there are a number of I think, additional schemes that were brought forward as a consequence of the pandemic, and the holiday hunger issue was one of them. And clearly, it is a very, very beneficial and a very necessary scheme. There is some, I think, discussion around how far we can ring-fence support for that in the time ahead, and we will certainly do all that we can within the restrictions that are placed on us by the absence of an executive to make sure that critical areas such as that do get the support they need, and we will, leave no stone unturned in that regard. Of course, then, as I've said many times in response to all of these issues, the best and most certain way that we can have of providing a level of support that's needed right across the community is to ensure that we have the ability to sit around the table as a collective with all of our differences, but take decisions, as we've been doing over the last 2 years, take decisions to try and provide support where it is needed most, and that's what we need to do in the time ahead.
Call Padraig Larry for supplementary.
Thank the Minister for his answer, and just as follow on from that, as well as denying free school meals to children, can the Minister outline how many additional resources are denied to the beleaguered health service and its overstretched workers by, again, the DUP's reckless and self-serving actions?
Well, as I say, the draft budget that was proposed did make a very significant allocation to the Department for Health to try and address a lot of the long-standing issues that have been plaguing our health department as a consequence of austerity budgets for many years, and it was to try and finally address the issues of employing people, of trying to fix issues around cancer services, waiting lists, reforming the health service itself. And so all of those things do go on hold until such times as we can agree the allocations that are necessary for them. Health does have the finances to continue to provide services, but we all know, anybody who's in this chamber knows very well, that if health is only treading water, then it's in effect getting worse. And so our ability to try and do anything to support the people who rely on that, but also to support the department and to try and fix public spend around health, needs budgetary approval through an executive process.
I call George Robinson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Deputy Speaker. Mr. Deputy Speaker, after the very successful voucher scheme carried out by the Economy Department, led by a DUP minister, what can you do to assist our high street coming out of 2 to 3 years of the pandemic?
Well, I think that the holiday or the voucher scheme was, by all accounts, was successful, and I'm very glad that it was, because I think it did stimulate some spending on the high street. And I know from talking, like himself being a rural representative and talking to small towns, they did feel the benefit of that from certainly anecdotal evidence that I've received, and so I'm very glad. Our ability to do extra schemes requires approval, so that's just a fact of life. If we want, and it would be for the Department of the Economy to bring forward propositions to try and support businesses on the high street in the time ahead. But their ability to do that requires approval. If it's a specific scheme that it wants executive funding for, then it will require an executive in place to give that approval. And when we haven't got an executive in place, there is not much more we can do. However, we have been taking forward a rates initiative, and he will know that many businesses will benefit from a further 3-month rate holiday in the new financial year right up to July. And that, for a lot of those businesses, that will mean they haven't paid any business rates from April 2020 to right through to July 2022. And so that is a very significant saving for all of them. But specific projects and programmes in support of High Street would have to be brought forward by the Department of Economy and approved by an executive.
I call George Robinson for supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, apart from your answer, could I ask the Minister, who have you engaged with to come up with innovative ways to help this sector, where some businesses in smaller towns such as Limavady have had such a torrid time during and after the pandemic?
Yes, well, I did mention that with the rates relief that we're given, we're also, and part of the debate today will be on the start-up schemes, where we're improving the ability to give rate support for people who are doing start-up businesses in the time ahead. And I am very conscious, as he is, and I know that he will be retiring from his post in the time ahead, and I wish him well in the future. He's been a very effective representative for his own community in East Derry. But can I say that we all have a collective responsibility to try and do what we can. We recognise that small towns and small businesses, which are the backbone of our economy here, are under pressure, and whatever measures, be that rates relief, be that schemes to try and improve the high street, to encourage people into town centres, then we have a collective responsibility to try and do that. But some of that will, as he undoubtedly knows, require the ability of us all to sit around a table and agree those schemes and agree what funding is allocated for them.
I call Rachel Woods.
Deputy Speaker, and thank the Minister for his answers so far. The Minister will be aware that the Department of Justice is the only one where general allocations are insufficient to cover the baseline cut, and therefore Justice would see a net budget decrease for the next budget draft. This is despite the fact, as with health, which is the main beneficiary, the Justice budget includes legal aid, which is also a demand-led welfare service. So could the Minister detail which departments, other than Justice, will see a net budget decrease under the terms of the draft budget?
Well, I don't believe that the Justice will see a net budgetary decrease, and we've had this discussion many times. I think all departments receive a budgetary increase over each of the 3 years under the proposed draft budget. And I have met with the people within the Law Society to discuss matters of legal aid and what support could be provided for the department. So she will know that the department has autonomy over its own budget and can prioritise areas that it feels are most in need of support. And that's going to be the choices facing all executive departments, regardless of what budget might finally arrive with us, in what time it may arrive. Departments will then have to prioritise within the funding they have. We don't have all of the funding that we would like to have to do all of the things that we want to do, and that's just been the impact of 10 years of austerity budgets, which have cut public services to the bone. So when we do get the opportunity for a 3-year budget, we have to plan and prioritise across the collective priorities of the executive, but then each departmental minister has to prioritise within the allocation they have, and that's where the legal aid issue should and could be sorted.
I call Rachel Woods for supplementary.
the Minister for his answer. Legal professionals have warned that the Justice net budget decrease would cause, and I quote, generational harm to the justice system. So could the Minister offer an assessment of how the draft budget may impact on the provision of legal aid as a public service?
Well, again, I would hope none, because I do think that it is within the authority of the Department for Justice, if it considers this to be a serious enough matter, to provide the support that is necessary for it. And across a number of years, as I say, I did do a meeting with those who are directly responsible for provision of services which rely on legal aid, and I had a discussion with them about what is required. And in my view, that if the department themselves consider that to be a priority, that they can find the funding to do that. That's not to say that doesn't stretch other services, and that's going to be the same decision that every single department has to take. When you prioritise something which is of significant importance, then you deprioritise something else, and that's the balancing exercise we all have to do within the limited financial framework that we have.
And that is the end of our period of time of questions to the Minister for Finance. I'd ask members to take their ease before the next item of business.